right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Thanks everybody for joining me today. And this is kind of a rough time of day right after lunch, so hopefully everybody's got a nice caffeinated beverage. And we're going to be looking at System Monitor, Windows Sysmon, from a forensic angle, and we'll get into a lot of this. So I'm just going to jump right in, go ahead and give everybody a chance to settle in here. By way of introduction, my name is Gerard Johansen. I am a principal, Security Solution Specialist. I've gone through 3 title changes in the last 2 years, so you're going to have to forgive me on that one. At Red Canary. Anybody familiar with Red Canary? All right, wow, okay. I'm going to have to tell marketing they're doing an awesome job. Been in the industry a little over 10 years. This is actually my second go-around into something. I spent 10 years in law enforcement at the state and federal level, most of that working in cybercrime. So this was kind of a natural transition, but a little bit different coming at it. Also an author. If you've seen the Digital Forensics and Incident Response book from PACT, I'm the author. And I'm based out of Rapid City, South Dakota. So if anybody's heading up to Wild West Hacking Fest, make sure you stop and say hi, because I'm always at that con because it's only like 45 minutes up the road. The genesis of what we're going to talk about today, why I wanted to talk about this, is a couple of things. If you're transitioning, say, from security operations or cybersecurity analyst as a role, and you're moving into the digital forensics or incident response space, or you just have an interest in it, I wanted to give anybody, really, that will listen, a starting point, where to actually start. One of the kind of drawbacks that we have is there's a lot of good training out there, there's a lot of good education, but sometimes we get wrapped around the axle and we go to the last data point that we're familiar with. So you go ahead and take, say, an advanced endpoint forensics class, and you learn about the AM cache and the shim cache and the prefetch file to identify maybe suspicious executions. That's the one thing that you're going to rely on. Just give me the prefetch or just give me the AM cache. And I've actually heard analysts say this. So that's one of the unique challenges that we have. So we need something to actually start us off. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the Windows System Monitor as a tool. Real quick overview on installing and customization. This is not a discussion on how do we do this. Really, it's more of getting you set up, showing you some of the power of it, and then actually pivoting into some of the key data points that we can get from this. We'll look at endpoint detection and timelining. So I'm actually going to do some live demos. I'm knocking on wood here that they go as well as live demos can in this type of situation, but to kind of show you some of the tools and techniques that you can go ahead and start extracting data points off of Sysmon. So I talked about one of the unique challenges, but the key is where to start. And again, going back to that, you're the victim of the last training that you took in terms of what you're going to extract and what you're going to analyze starting an investigation. But what happens very quickly is sand gets into the gears. If I said, hey, I want to see if, for example, a link file was opened or a DLL file is open, I may not have that type of visibility in the AM cache or the shim cache, master file tables, something like that. 99% of our evidence is on less than 1% of the disk. Having said that, that's still 600 to 800 megabytes. If you went out and used, say, anybody familiar with Kroll Artifact Parser and Extractor or Velociraptor, one of those tools? Anywhere from 600 to 800 megabytes of data that you have to go into. And here's the other thing. That is completely unstructured in a lot of ways. It's also in, for example, the registry. You have to utilize special tools for the registry. Utilize special tools for the master file table and USN journal. So all of these are disparate all over the place. And to just dive into one, imagine trying to do a day or two of analysis and activity on the master file table. How many entries, how many programs are changed on just a common 24, 48-hour period? It's very tough for us to really do that. So what we're really looking for is a good starting point. Here's the other thing. We may suspect a system is compromised. It exists in this weird gray area between we know it's completely bricked because there's a ransomware note on it, or it's not compromised. It's purely not been touched, we're good. There's a gray area. So one of the other key aspects to this is identifying some of those behaviors that are in that gray area if you're lucky enough to find yourself investigating, say, an attack in progress. Before they've gotten to encrypt things, maybe they're in post-exploitation, some of these things are easily identified when we're looking at, say, process execution, things that are executing. So for example, if you're starting to see, net commands, even whoami.exe on an endpoint, you know you may have a situation that you're going to have to take care of. The big thing here is we're going to start with a pivot point because System Monitor or Sysmon gives us such a wide range of activity that we can see. It gives you enough detail to maybe make some decisions, but it also gives you a starting point to actually pivot to do some of those other deeper analysis. So by way of overview, Sysmon is short for System Monitor. The authors, Mark and Thomas. This is a free tool. It is not default on the Windows operating system. It is something that has to be installed. It's a system and device driver, so it actually will get in very deep into the operating system. And it monitors and logs system activity, and then it writes those just to an EVTX file. So one of the other things I like to use Sysmon for, and one of the constructs we'll demonstrate real quick, is it can actually mimic a lot of what an endpoint detection and response tool can do. Now, it's more on the driver and device end, and creating that telemetry, you need something else to consume that telemetry, but you can actually mimic a lot of the behavior. So if you don't have access to CrowdStrike, you don't have access to, I was going to say Carbon Black, but MDE or one of the other EDR tools out there, we'll actually do a quick demo on how you can actually get a lot of EDR type capability just through the Sysmon integration with the tool that we're going to look at. So what this does for you is it actually gives you a little bit of exposure to this if you don't have any of the access to those other tools. So if you're running this in a home lab or you're doing something as a proof of concept, you can actually get a little bit of that, most of the functionality. I would say a majority of the functionality that you would get out of some of those other tools. So let's kind of look at this from a forensic end. Let's say we get an alert or we get some sort of behavior that we want to investigate. So this is kind of generally some of the larger groupings of information that we can gather. Process creation, this is a big one. So one of the obvious issues we have are legitimate binaries being used. And this will give us some really good data in terms of what's being executed on the command line, what are their current and parent processes. So we pivot into the network. Oftentimes, this is one of the blank areas that I saw myself as an incident responder really had a hard time with. We would have plenty of endpoint telemetry, but any type of network indicators, unless they were running something specific. In this case, though, Sysmon will capture that. They'll capture that network connections, give us an IP address or DNS queries. Again, give us an IP address and a domain. So we're starting to work with some of those network indicators that we, again, cross-reference. Persistence. WMI event consumers. This is one where you might see a threat actor toss a PowerShell script that's actually a download cradle within WMI so that every time it reboots, after an hour of being live, it goes out, reaches down, downloads, installs our beacon, and they're back up and running. So we think we've cleaned the system or we've knocked them out, or we're just going to reboot everything. This is one area that we can actually get into some visibility into what they're doing. Same thing with any type of registry rights. But like any tool, especially free tools, I like to say free tools are free like a puppy. They're fantastic, but there is some overhead in terms of making sure it works for you. From a good, it's deep visibility into the endpoint. This gives you an incredible amount of visibility into the endpoint and what it's doing. Again, very much like an EDR tool, it's getting into that granular level of what's going on. So for example, Contrast a Sysmon entry with, say, just any standard application log. Those are very good, or even security logs. We're getting a lot more detail, and as we start to look through some of these specific ones, you'll see that. Very deep visibility into the endpoint, what endpoints are doing. It is very detailed, as I said. It is a great first step in your triage process. If you have this enabled, you have Sysmon enabled, say, on even just critical systems, and you've got a larger incident and you want to see if those have been impacted, this is a great starting position. It gives you a lot of detail, not just on a specific aspect, but on a complete sequence of activity that's been going on that endpoint. So if we look at something like a download, we can see a download and then potentially executed. And we'll talk a little bit about, when we get into a little bit more detail, about what that actually looks like. So here's the bad, or ish. Here's the trade-off. It's very loud. Sysmon is incredibly loud. I've run experiments and just installed Sysmon on a Windows evaluation ISO, hooked it up to Splunk, and left it running, and within 24 hours I could have close to 22 to 25,000 separate log entries. So imagine you have 200 or 300 endpoints and you're doing your monthly patch updates, and how much of that activity is going to get logged. So it's very loud. This makes it very difficult for organizations to leverage as, say, a primary logging source. You are going to have a really hefty Azure spend if you're sending this to Sentinel. You're going to have a very heavy Splunk spend if you're trying to send this to Splunk. So it's often not something that you can actually turn on and log, with a caveat. We'll get to the caveat in a few. It also logs all sorts of legitimate behavior. And that means that if, again, say Patch Tuesday comes around, all of that activity of new registry rights, new processes, new drivers loaded, new DLLs used, all of that gets recorded. So all of that's legitimate behavior. So there needs to be techniques and tools that we can utilize that will allow us to pivot into specific areas and to also really focus on the bad versus all of that noise. And again, because we're capturing all of this legitimate behavior, all of this just innocuous, sometimes benign, all the way to just, hey, this is the normal background noise of the Windows operating system, alerting can be tough to do on your own. That's the caveat. As crafting out alerts can be very tough. So we talked about the good and the bad. Let's kind of just walk through real quick how to install this. Not going to demo this because it's way too short. But essentially, and I will just say a side note, these slides will be available to anybody that has them, anybody that wants them. I will make them freely available, so you can just email me. I'll share my email at the end, so there's no need they were designed specifically to be a kind of a resource. So you're going to download the Sysmon executable, and it's available on Microsoft's site. They update it fairly regularly. Went through a big update within the last year, and you just download an executable. The piece that is really, I talked about, very loud, one of the ways to kind of tune this out is a configuration file. I threw one up here. It is basically Olaf's. He's one of the key players in this space and has a lot of good configuration files for Sysmon. It's a straight up XML file, and it tells the Sysmon executable what to log. So I talked about it being very loud. This is where you can actually tune out a lot of behaviors that you don't need. So let's say you did want to have all high-risk servers, 20 to 30 high-risk servers, forwarding logs, Sysmon logs. You might only want to capture, for example, process execution, right? You shouldn't see a lot of processes executing on your domain controller on a regular basis, especially something like run DLL or psexec. So those are really good ones to extract. So you may not say, hey, I just want network connections and maybe process execution. That's all I want. or DNS queries or something of that nature. You can actually make your own configuration files that'll tune it all the way down so that you can tune it very, very verbose, where you're capturing everything, or down to very specific things. So once you have a configuration file and that executable, you just go ahead and run it. And this is the actual command, and it starts logging. It starts logging the minute you start turning it on. This is also a persistent process, so every time you reboot, it will survive a reboot and it'll keep on logging. There's also expanding the default storage. I can generally get about 64 megabytes, which is a couple of days of logging, which is always really, really handy to have, especially in more long-term incidents. You can expand the default storage and then just let it go, and then enjoy it. A couple of ways to view these. Windows Event Viewer, not my preferred method to actually look at these. There's a tool, Event Log Explorer. Anybody use Event Log Explorer? It's one of my favorites. Yeah, it makes Event Viewer look, again, you can pull these into an event management system, especially if you want to select specific systems. This is really good for a honeypot system. This is really good for those high-risk servers that you may want to pull in data, or servers that are just very static, don't have a lot of changes to them. And then also endpoint detection and response tools. So we'll go ahead and walk through some selected Windows System Event IDs and kind of how they correspond and really help out from a forensic perspective. So we're looking at about 20 to 30 depending on your configuration. That number one, process creation, that is a big one. If the threat actor drops a new process or runs, one of the common techniques that we see constantly is DLL files executed with run DLL. So run DLL32.exe, executing something, it's really handy. And now those are kind of the data points that we can alert off of, is if we have a Sysmon event ID, one with run DLL32 executing, that's something that we want to look at. Same thing with that network connection. File create. So if you're starting to look at this from an attack chain, what you would see is potentially a network connection. And you see the IP address and it's like, that looks like GitHub. And all of a sudden you see a file created and it's a PowerShell file. And then all of a sudden, PowerShell is used to execute that file. In those three, we've started to piece together a potential attack chain. As we start to work our way up as well, we've got WMI events, DNS queries, file deletes. All of these things are things that we can actually look for. But when we're looking at those things in red, those are very important, really kind of highlighting. Doesn't mean some of the others are not important. Dana in the back actually did a wonderful talk on drivers and device drivers. And again, you can still see that there's very little logging available for when those are loaded and when those are executed. But if we're looking at number 6, we can see, hey, if somebody is actually downloading their own driver and then executing it, and then going to use that as a backdoor, this is giving us that visibility. So let's kind of walk through some of the key ones and what we can actually use these for and then where to pivot from. So ID1, this is Event ID1 from Sysmon, process creation. This is where you will see executables, DLL, EXEs, actually execute. So this is really good for identifying living off the land binaries as well. If they're using PowerShell, run DLL32, PSExec for lateral movement, WMI for lateral movement, you will see that execute inside the Sysmon event ID entry. The major data point that Sysmon has among other logging sources is file hashes. So if you're looking at the image, kind of in the lower third of that raw text in the middle, obviously a little too small to see, but that's where you will find hash values for what is executed and what executed it. So think about this. If I think that there's malicious activity, somebody dropped a malicious file, QBot, something like that, on the system, and I don't know where it is on the system. It's on a 1 terabyte drive somewhere in the file on the file system. Is this malicious file? If I see it executed, I don't have to necessarily find it immediately. I have the hash value. I can go drop it in VirusTotal or any run or any one of the threat intelligence sources and figure out, okay, this is what the file is, and I can gain some insight into what's actually happened. So the key evidence that we have is this will give us a pivot point to say into the prefetch entries. Just to confirm, we might want to see where it's located in the prefetch entry. Because what the prefetch entry will give us, pivoting off of this, is how many times it was executed. If it is something that's been surviving reboots and we see 3 or 4 or 5 executions on that prefetch, we know we've got a long-term issue. Or if it's just executed once, again, we're starting to get more and more information just off of this single data point. We might actually be able to go to the master file table and find the location of this actual executable or DLL file or a PowerShell script that was used to run. All of this is really good information, but I'm giving you a starting point so that you don't have to go through 300,000 lines of the master file table, or I don't have to give you, you have to go out and find the prefetch and grab it and process it. Immediately you can start to look at these things. Here's the other thing. Sometimes you may want to go into the memory image. If it's something really unique, you're running it and you're like, nobody knows what this binary is, and it's no longer on the disk. So you may have to go into the memory, but at least it gives you some file name to maybe pivot off of when you do a process list. Netcons, network connections are huge. Again, talking about that kind of lack of visibility into that. So command and control traffic. Or tool transfers. Tool transfers are huge too. And I'm not kidding when I've seen actual GitHub repositories used, the Mimikatz GitHub, like literally just, they're so lazy they won't even set up their own infrastructure. They just point their script to download it from GitHub. I shouldn't say lazy, they're efficient. Tool transfers are huge, all right? Sharphound. Go out and just grab Sharp. Don't even set up your own infrastructure. You can do this all on a PowerShell script in a download cradle, download Sharphound in the root of C, you dial in, just let it run, grab the graph, and you've got a map of their Active Directory environment. Process ID, this is the thing, is I can tie a process ID to an actual potentially malicious process. What's the image? Source destination IP and source destination ports. All key data points. So what I do then is, let's say I look and I see an IP address. One place to look, it may sound kind of weird, is to go right into the PowerShell logs, whether they're operational, and hopefully you've got script block logging, where you're taking the entire script block. And it may be in base64, so you may just go hunt and say, hey, do I see anything base64 encoded? Because what you can actually start to do is reconstruct, or I should say, analyze that beacon and go ahead and find out what it was doing, where it was going. And then network evidence sources. Once you get that IP address, start looking for other network connections. So really good pivot point with this. I get a netcon, I go ahead and pivot to the firewall, and I find any other infected system in the enterprise that's possibly connected to that IP address. File create. Again, one of the things that is very tough is to see, without going and processing the master file table, and even just the last 4 to 6 hours or the last 24 hours, processing those master file table entries and actually going through and figuring out which one is a suspicious file, that's a lot of overhead. So something like ID 11, where we see a file created on the system. So this is scripts, dump files. This is another thing, is Mimikatz, for example, will kick out a dump file, or procdump will kick out a dump file sometimes. And if you see a text file dump after a suspicious execution, they're grabbing something, whether it's recon data, whether it's they're dumping the LSAS process. So again, file create is actually a really good one. A lot of people overlook that when they're doing the initial pass, but hey, see what was actually executed in the last hour and then what files were created afterwards. This gives us target file names to pivot off of, and maybe we can find those on disk, and it also gives the creation time. So you notice we're doing a lot with time as well, because this is building that attack chain, as we can see a lot of activity with that attack chain. From there, we may have to go into disk evidence. We have to go to the master file table, the USN journal, to see if it was deleted or modified. Sometimes you might just want to grab the dump file of the PowerShell and see what it actually was doing and what information the threat actor actually captured. WMI is another one we talked about. WMI is really, really handy for that persistence. Same thing with registry, but this is where you will actually get all three. So if you're not familiar with WMI, that's not a problem. Just think about it. There's three things that happen. It takes an event, a consumer. So, hey, when this system reboots, I want you to execute this PowerShell command, and it ties it together with a binding. That's three separate actions that happen. So if I've got WMI activity in that way, not just, hey, I'm laterally moving, what you'll see is three log entries. And then this is your clue to go into the WMI operational logs to find out actually what happened. Sometimes you can actually grab the filter. You can actually grab, hey, it's executing this, or it's going to do this. You can even go to the WMI repository if you're that that keen to go diving into there and actually look at, hey, what's happening. DNS events. This is the other one. Is going back to network connections. We see network connections, but we also have DNS queries. This was a relatively new development, but if you look at the query results, it gives you all of the different, whether it's IPv, the quad A or the A records. It gives you that IP address and what the query is. So if we're looking at a threat actor that's set up a fairly sophisticated infrastructure for command and control, where they may be doing rotating their DNS records to different IPs, fast flux DNS, something of that nature, that IP address may no longer be, that we saw in event ID 3, may no longer be valid, but we now have a domain that may also be indicative of that command and control traffic. So we pivot into the proxy server, we pivot into maybe the firewall to marry that up. And the same thing. Sometimes these are contained in PowerShell logs in terms of how they've been executed. All right, I've talked a lot. I want to kind of show you some of the features and some of the information that we can get out of this by more of a live demo. So the first one we're going to look at is that EDR type of capability. And then in this case, we're going to use a free tool called Waza. And basically, it is a open source endpoint detection and response logging capability / actual alerting that it can actually execute on specific logs that we have. So we're going to go ahead and pivot into there. This is a really simple construct. This is one of the easiest to set up. There is a configuration change that you do have to make, and I actually leave that article in the resources. But if you were to set up a virtual machine, they have a very straightforward OVA file that you can fire up and get started probably in about 10-15 minutes. This doesn't take a lot of time to actually set up. We're going to look, what I've done, and we'll talk a little bit about it in a minute, is actually used a script that is available, again, in the resources on a GitHub, public repository GitHub, and it has a number of Atomic Red Team testing. I'm not going to talk about Atomic Red Team at all because the next talk in this room is going to be about Atomic Red Team, so I'm going to leave it for the experts there. But what it does is they're aligned to even specific IDs for Sysmon. So it is a Sysmon tuning emulation plan. It doesn't do any specific threat or anything like that. It's just used for this purpose. So you can actually create Sysmon logs. So in this case, just ran this about 2 hours ago. We're going to go ahead and fire that off. And I'll show you kind of some of the alerts that'll come out of the execution of that script. The first one, which is probably right at the top, is command and control or an executable file dropped in a folder commonly used by malware. What this tool is doing is taking that telemetry from Sysmon and running it through a series of Sigma rules, essentially open source IDS IPS rules. And it's actually comparing behaviors that are indicative of that kind of malicious activity. This is not necessarily meaning it is malicious. In this case, it's really just testing. But this is a really solid way to both understand what telemetry Sysmon provides and how that telemetry can actually be run through a series of rules and actually give you a starting position or an alert. So this would be one that you would want to look at. So again, we have a PowerShell execution. It's giving us a window event ID 11, but we have a PowerShell PowerShell script actually on the disk. It gives us where it actually hit, and that's very common to see an app data local temp folder. And this is a very interesting place for us it's a highly abused directory within the Windows operating system. And this is where you would find all of the garbage that maybe a user downloaded into the temp folder before it got moved to desktop. So from here, very simply, if I go to the disk and maybe extract the PowerShell script, hopefully it's still there. If I don't see this script there, potentially it could have been deleted, but then I can pivot into the PowerShell logs to see if it's been executed. And hopefully, again, we've got the script block logging all configured so that we can actually extract. So this is a really good way to see that attack chain where the attacker got in, downloaded a secondary payload via GitHub or any type of repository they've got set up. It's a PowerShell script. It starts a Cobalt Strike beacon, and that's how they're gaining the foothold and then actually executing. And all of this can be found just by a simple Sysmon event ID and actually where to pivot. So some of the others that we'll go a little deeper in here. This is a very good one too, is where we see CMD executing essentially a defense evasion attack. And in this case, one of the Atomic Red Team tests is that actually it unloads the Sysmon driver for you. So this is a common, you'll see, defense evasion technique, if they can get away with it, is actually unload the driver that's used by, say, an antivirus or a logging agent so that they can actually go ahead and do all of their nefarious activities without being detected. So this is another good one that you might see. And again, all we're doing is looking at data that's freely available to us. And in this case, it's just a process execution or executed command line utility that's being used to offload the actual Sysmon driver to stop the logging. This is the last test I usually put in that type of emulation plan, because if you put it like 2/3 down, you've got nothing else that'll log. But that's actually part of the emulation plan. If you go ahead and download it and look at it, you'll see at the last part, I unload the driver. But this is what it looks like on the back end from our perspective. This is a really good alert. It's like, hey, somebody's offloading the driver or unloading the driver. Really good thing to pivot off of. So this is Waza and Sysmon. This is, again, freely available. It takes you about 10, 15 minutes to set up, and it will give you that kind of EDR style telemetry and also allow you to really kind of dig into specific events and really kind of look at what they're doing. Let's say, though, you don't have access to this. This hasn't been set up in your organization, and you just have the logs themselves and nothing else. So we're going to walk through kind of two different techniques that we can use to look at logs. One is, again, going to be using Sigma rules and a tool called Hayabusa. This is a tool from the Japanese Computer Incident Response Team. I believe it's their national Computer Incident Response Team. And basically what it does is it processes EVTX files against a set of Sigma rules. And what it does for us is actually focus our attention on specific things that we're going to need to actually look at. So in this case, all I'm going to do is point the tool. It's freely available. Again, resources are at the end of the presentation. It will create a timeline in CSV format for us that we can actually start to pivot off of. So I'm just going to go ahead and run it. It's not going to take too long. It's going to ask me a few questions. One of the things is this is constantly updated, the Hayabusa tool. So emerging threat rules are always good to have. And this one is actually asking for the specific Sysmon rules, which is about 1,400. So as you can see, and we're going to show you why this may be your best first option when processing Sysmon, say, related to a security event or something of that nature, is we're going to see how many come out of Hayabusa, and then we're actually going to process maybe the last 3 hours of Sysmon log entries to see what the difference looks like. So we're going to go ahead and use the Sysmon rules as well. Goes out, reaches out, grabs the detection rules, and actually starts processing it. And this may take a few minutes. Okay. So it took a little less than a minute to process this. So think about this from a workflow. You get an alert from the security operations, or you working in security operations. You get some sort of alert coming across, and it's very discrete in time. It's this time, this date, this happened. And you want to see what happened before and after that event. But you want to focus your attention. What we're doing is we're seeing top critical alerts, process access, process execution, shell code injection. There's actually a code injection test that's actually run. User process and download cradles, all of these. So we're looking at just a tick under maybe 400 or 500 event IDs in that event log that we want to look at. So if we go up to analysis, you can see where it actually outputs some logs for you, and we'll go ahead and open that. So one of the key differentiators between this and just say raw logs is it's actually giving you some context around why Hayabusa said, hey, I want you to look at this because this could be a very important piece of the overall puzzle. And these are probably impossible to see, but if I just click in there, what this is telling us is this is basically the payload. This is what Sysmon is kicking back from a informational standpoint. And in this case, Windows command prompt was used to execute something. In this case, explorer.exe. Maybe legitimate, probably legitimate, but maybe the threat actor is RDPing and they just are downloading stuff from file shares and just copying it into Windows Explorer. All of these things, again, you have to look at, but what it's doing is giving you some of that context around what's going on. Here's another one where we have PowerShell running. We're only looking, though, we're focusing our attention on 571 entries, which is a little bit more manageable than what I'm going to show you next, but it is something that is really useful. But from this standpoint, this is our focusing our energy on what we really can place some suspicion around and still have a fairly decent timeline of activity. But again, what Hayabusa is doing is it's counting on those sigma rules to focus our energy. If we want to back out and get a full picture of, say, the last 3 hours of activity, we'll walk through that right now. So in this case, we're going to use a tool called Velociraptor. Anybody use Velociraptor? Okay, it is an awesome tool. It is a free and open source tool by the folks at Rapid7. And I'll give you the 60-second elevator pitch. It is basically a remote evidence acquisition tool. And we're going to use it to acquire the last 3 hours of Sysmon, or last 2 hours of Sysmon activity on a system. So what we do is we dial into the system that we're managing. That's the system that I ran the Atomic Red Team on. I'm going to use a tool, an artifactor called Sysmon Triage. And I'm going to configure the parameters. And in this case, we're going to do 7200s. Yeah, that should be good. Let's do this. Yeah, 7200 should be, that's 2 hours. And then we're just going to go ahead and let it run. So let's look, Hayabusa, we had 571 entries. Those are run through a detection analytic for us to really focus our energy. From a workflow perspective, you might say, hey, there's a lot of suspicious activity that I need to take care of and look at. As I'm looking at this, I may have to go in and look at something else. And in this case, and we're going to go ahead, extract this out. And this gave us a little bit more information, 780 lines of data. But as you can see, I've got essentially a timeline built around what is actually happening on that system. I can pivot by event IDs. Maybe I want to see if there's, here's some executions. Oh, and luck would have it that I picked the one that's run DLL 32. It's not really luck, I didn't really do much with the operating system after I ran the test, but this is what that run DLL might look like. Meaning somebody's using run DLL to actually execute something, a DLL file on the operating system, or bypass the normal DLLs and put their own malicious DLL files, something that you want to actually look at. But what we have now is, if I kind of back out a little bit, I've got a time that this actually executed. So what I can do is start to work backwards. A lot of activity that we're looking at, I can start to look backwards for other type of activity, whether it's a network connection, whether it's other files that are placed on the system, something of that nature. But this is what's often referred to, some people refer to it as a Sysmon smear or an event log smear, where it's not necessarily a date and time, but really kind of a smear of activity over the last 2 hours on the Windows operating system. And it gives you some that's very visible. It's also easier to manage than saying having to go through 50,000 lines of event logs and actually start to work through it. So really think about Sysmon from kind of that first pass, that initial pass, giving you that idea of what's happened, as well as ways to pivot into various other evidence sources so that you're really focusing your energy and you're not trying to do too much right off the bat. It's a really good way to focus, and using tools like Hayabusa and even Velociraptor to really kind of get down into that period of time that you really need to focus in. So we talked about Hayabusa and the Sysmon timeline. All of this is again, you can go ahead and grab the slides, but use this to get that timeline and then work through and pivot into specific aspects of the attack chain that you really want to look at and start extracting more of that dispositive evidence. Any questions? I threw a lot out there. Yes? Procmon is very detailed on actually grabbing the memory space of basically what's assigned to a process. So I'll tell you how they work together is if you find run DLL 32 or some other process was created, you can use proctump to grab the actual code in memory, and then that you can actually do some reverse engineering or use memory analysis tools against it. It will tell you, it depends on the alert logic on the back end. So Sysmon won't tell you anything if you have a detection for that, and generally it will not, because it's just going off of what the operating system is telling it what it did. What I would say though is if you're looking like that is a weird process to be running, that would be something that you would have to put your eyeballs on and say that's a weird process that doesn't look right. I'm sorry, what kind of tools? Windows Defender is getting better and better. We split a lot of our, so Windows Defender is getting better and better at detecting a lot of this, what would be referred to as semi-legitimate looking activity. That's not. So PowerShell, for example, PowerShell, if you're running it with no profile or encoded, man, you could have the most benign PowerShell script that just downloads kitten pictures, and man, Defender will be like, oh, no, you have no profile loaded in, it's encoded. No, you don't get to do that. So it will, the Defender is getting much, much better. Yes? I'm sorry, one more time? That I don't know. Yeah. Again, Sysmon is just going to tell you exactly what Windows is telling it. So that's kind of the general rule when you're working with that kind of event ID. Or that kind of event telemetry. Sorry. Anybody else? Okay. Thank you. Here's my email. If you want to copy the slides, let me know. These are all the resources that I used to build this, so feel free. They're contained on here. There is the Atomic Red Team. Again, stay here for the more detailed examination of Atomic Red Team, but there is an emulation script. If there's any problems with it, let me know. Swift on security and the other Sysmon config that we used, and some other resources. So feel free to grab these. Again, hit me up if you want a copy of the slides. But thank you very much. I appreciate everybody coming out.